Right, I want to talk on service delivery, and in doing so, I want to get to some of the issues that will recur in this this course. So firstly, I just want to say something about the poor state of service delivery in South Africa and give some evidence that this results from classroom behavior when one is talking about education. Then I want to talk about service delivery and accountability frameworks, the principal-agent problem and the short and long route to accountability, why public service delivery is difficult, and particularly the issue of weak feedback loops, the necessity of information for this, and then information and accountability. So let's start with the poor state of the education system, the nature of the beast. That's what we want to look at, is our education system. So let's just get an idea of what it is that we are still at the moment failing to do in the broad state of affairs. So first let's just look at what's happened in South Africa in the last decade or so. And we see that if one looks at a measure of poverty, which is asking households whether children went hungry in the past year or not, we see that there had been a considerable improvement from the early 2000s to the present. So things have been improving on some fronts. And the improvement has largely been because money has been transferred to people in the form of grants, and that has made quite a difference. Also some jobs were created, etc. And then we had the 2008 economic crisis, and that is still affecting us, so some of that advances were overturned. But broadly speaking, we've been doing better in poverty alleviation, but we have not been doing better in terms of service delivery, and I'll give you some examples of this. We have done well in terms of getting everybody at school. Even in 1995, virtually everybody of school-going age, or at least up to age 15, was at school. This is according to the surveys, and we see that between the age group 6 and 16, virtually everybody is at school. And thereafter, more people drop out, etc. So we're getting some things right. In many other developing countries, the issue is how many people are actually in the school system. Now let's look at our system, our school system, and link it to the labor market, because in a sense, that is what people, parents, communities, the country expect of our education system, is to deal with our problems in the labor market. So if you look at the labor market, you've got one part of it which is high productivity, high income, and about 10 to 15% of our population is in that. And typically those are people with high levels of education, often degrees. We have a low productivity sector with low productivity jobs and incomes, very many people unemployed or not getting very high incomes. We have, in terms of the school system, a part of the school system, 10 to 15% of schools that are performing adequately or better than adequately. And these are mainly historically white and Indian schools, but not exclusively so, but mainly those. And we have then the rest of the school system, which is still offering relatively low quality of education in terms of cognitive outcomes. And you could say that linking the labor market and the school system, those in the high quality schools end up in the high quality jobs. Those in the weak schools end up in jobs which are less attractive or unemployed. There are some who manage to move up through vocational training, affirmative action policies, etc. There are some schools trying to make that transition, and some children who make the transition because their parents can pay to get them into relatively good schools. And then there are some individuals, and that's an important factor, but it's something that we know too little about yet. Some individuals come from low quality schools, and somehow make it into the upper part of the labor market. And that is an important factor, and something that we need to study still and understand better. But if one thinks of this, if one thinks of the needs of the labor market, then clearly our education system is not delivering. It's not delivering for the bulk of the people who are condemned, in a sense, to low quality jobs, low unemployment, etc., because of the weak education they're still receiving. So just let's look, for instance, at the period since the transition, roughly, from 1992 to 2007. We don't have racially broken down results every year, but those people getting university exemptions, those numbers have only been growing at 2.7% per year. Now we want to have an economic growth rate of 5% per year. We know that the economy is becoming more capital intensive and more technology intensive and requires more high skills. And the black population, which is a population which was underserved in the past, should be providing the bulk of these new entrants into that upper part of the labour market. It's not happening to the extent that the economy needs. It's not happening to the extent that people need in terms of their demands. So let's look at the classroom process and what it is that we can see. And here we start getting to indicators. We can see socioeconomic background. We can see parent, education, etc. Those are potentially measurable things. We can measure the inputs in the education system, the teachers, the textbooks, the learning support materials, the desks, the schools, etc. We can measure those. We can measure the outputs, the matriculants, those who drop out earlier, different grades. We can measure the cognitive levels they achieve, and those are some of the things, obviously, that when one talks about indicators, we should be talking about. What is more difficult to measure, but crucial for putting all this together, is what happens inside the school, and particularly what happens inside the classroom. And inside the classroom, we have incentives playing a role. What is it that makes teachers do what they do? What is it that makes them sometimes not do what they should be doing? How is the management? How is the organization? What is the learning process? If one thinks of it as a sort of production of type process. But largely, this to us is a blank. It's a black box. We don't really know what's going on inside the classroom. So measurement is very often about trying to infer what's going on in the classroom. You can't see what's going on in the classroom. So we measure the outcomes and we measure the inputs. And we say, if you've got lots of inputs, if you've got enough teachers, the teachers are, you've got enough textbooks, etc., then you should be doing fairly well in terms of outcomes. Why aren't you doing well in outcomes? So we're linking those inputs and outputs and inferring things about what's happening in the school because we can't necessarily observe it directly. There are ways, and the workbooks would be one way in which one can get a little more information as to what's happening in the classroom. If we use the workbooks the way they were intended, in other words, if we go into the classroom and observe how much of the curriculum has been covered, at what period in the year, etc. So one needs to think about that. This is in TIMS, there's a new TIMS coming out now. TIMS is an international study in maths and science, or testing maths and science knowledge. This was measured in grade 8 in 2003. We see here the dark blue are the countries, the developed countries. Here would be Eastern European and developing countries. And here is South Africa. The average across all these countries is 500. Performance on this, the test has been transformed so that the average is 500. South Africa is performing below 300. So for those who think in statistical terms, we're more than 2 standard deviations below the norm. Or if you put it differently, if it was a class of 40 children, we would be that bottom child. South Africa would be that bottom child in this class of 40. Let's look at our performance in PILS. PILS is a reading test. It's taken at grade 4. In South Africa, we measured it in grade 5. These, again, are a number of countries across the world. South Africa we don't start the axis at 0, so it looks worse than it actually is. But South Africa performed at a level of about 300, and the average again was 500. So we again 200 points, 2 standard deviations below the norm. Again, with the bottom child in 40. In this group of countries. Now compare us to African countries. This is SACMEC. Many of you know SACMEC. Who has worked with SACMEC at all? Looked at SACMEC data results? At least a few people have. SACMEC is 15 countries or 15 education ministries, 14 countries, because Zanzibar is not a separate country, but it is a separate education ministry for school education. 15 countries, and this is a performance, again, with the mean, the average across these countries said to be 500. We see South Africa performs just at about this average. But if one looks at the poorest children in South Africa, if we take the poorest 25% of the children in school, and you compare it to the poorest 25% of children in other countries, South Africa comes second to last. What it says is that not only is our education weak, but the education of the poor is much weaker than in other African countries, such as Swaziland, or in this case even below Namibia, and much below countries such as Kenya and Tanzania. Right. So that's the nature of the beast. That's the problem we have to deal with. Olivia did some work for a project, again, that UNICEF supported, where we were looking at public expenditure, or doing a public expenditure analysis, and one part of it for DVE, one part of it was looking at the ANA. Now you all know the ANA, the Annual National Assessment. In 2011 we had 2 parts to it, a verification ANA where we had exact results recorded for every question. So this is a question that was asked in ANA. 10%, this is asked of grade 7 children, 10% of 180 is, and you have to fill in the number. 88% of children got it completely wrong. Less than 3% could say 10% of 180 is 10 over 100 times 180, so they got 1 mark for it. And only 9.3% could answer this question. That's a grade 7 children not being able to answer this. If you look across the provinces, we see that one finds roughly the usual pattern, somewhat better in Gauteng and in the Western Cape, and in this case also in KwaZulu-Natal. Gauteng is not so, yes. But if one looks at the quintiles, you see that even in the top quintile, even in our best schools, or the better part of our school system, our richer schools, I should say, even there, only 1 out of 5 children could answer that question. Okay. And that's why we have the ANA, is to start measuring, to start seeing what is wrong in the system so that we can have a system whereby we have feedback loops. Just another question, what is the length of this pencil? As you can see, the correct answer is 15 centimeters. 40% of grade 3 students could answer that. Not what one would think is a difficult question. Right. Now a question asked of teachers in SACMEC. If a fence is raised from 60 to 75 centimeters, what is a percentage increase in height? More than half the teachers thought the answer was 15. More than half the maths teachers in grade 6 thought the answer was 15. Now, we clearly have a problem at the school level. And if we don't measure this, we don't see what's happening in the system. And that is the benefit of the ANA, that we now are able to look at each of these these schools separately and see how they do. But also just to indicate to you that the problem lies at the teacher level. We undertook a study in the Western Cape. Ronald Cornelissen knows all about that. And one of the questions we asked teachers in each grade was, what proportion of your children are usually on par when they start school, when they start the year, and how many are on par when they finish the year? So the grade 1 teachers said 47% were on par when they start, and when they leave grade 1, 80% of them are on par. So the grade 1 teachers were doing a good job, at least in their own self-assessment. Now, what do you think the grade 2 teachers thought? How many are on par? 79%? No. They thought only 56% were on par when they reached grade 2, but they also did a good job, self-assessed, and so did the grade 3 teachers. So everybody's doing a good job. Or at least everybody seems to think that they're starting with children who are not quite on par and taking more of them, getting more of them on par. What is the actual situation? How many are reaching the criteria that they should be reaching according to the Western Cape's Education Department's systemic evaluation? 22%. So teachers are completely overestimating how well they are doing, or put differently, they are completely underestimating the levels of cognitive demand that children should be working at. How do we know this? We only know this because we're measuring it. That's where we want to go in this course, is dealing with this issue of measurement. Just to give you something from the international studies, the teacher present and time on task, we see that there's a proportion of teachers who are not in class, but then there's also a high proportion, and Ghana is a very specific example. I didn't know it was so bad, Carol. Where one have a very large proportion of children, of teachers not at school, and an even higher proportion not teaching. So issues of this sort can be dealt with if one finds ways of appropriately measuring. Okay. So that's the first message from this. Right, this slide is out of place, but let's go there. This is South African performance in ANA. But not all the data were captured last year, and not all the provinces were at full capturing. So of those schools tested, one can say what proportion performed at different levels. And what we did is we took both the numeracy and the literacy numbers, and we took the average and asked what schools are performing at certain levels. So at a 70% level, it would be this top green group of schools. Again, these are the percentages at each level. Those performing below 30% on average would be this bottom dark red. But the ANA was set so that the 50% is really the appropriate level. So one should look at that. What is interesting from this is firstly to see that a lot of schools are not performing at that level. But importantly, and that's again where the information comes in, the indicator comes in. We can now, and this is my colleague Nick Spall, whom you'll meet on Thursday, his classification of countries, of schools. One can see that even in the poorest quintiles, we have some schools performing very well. We have never had such information before. ANA gives us that, potentially. As I say, only 7,600 primary schools captured here, so only about half of the primary schools, but we're already getting an indication there are some schools that are performing exceptionally well despite being poor. One has to test that and make sure that there hasn't been, that the process within the schools took place appropriately, etc., but it gives us some indication of that. So let's get to accountability which is where much of this course is going to through the use of indicators. This is a scheme that the World Bank often uses, and Bruns, Fulmer, and Patrinos all have various connections to the World Bank. They say you can think of the accountability structure as working this way. There's a long route to accountability where citizens hold the state accountable, and the state holds providers, whether it be clinics or schools or whatever. The state holds the schools accountable in our structure. There's a short route where citizens directly hold schools accountable. Now, which of these routes is a more common one in our schools? Is the accountability, does it happen through the state? In other words, that this long route is followed? Or is there direct accountability? Are schools being held directly accountable? What would you say? The short or the long route that happens? You think the short. Would you say that applies to most schools? That parents, clients, citizens hold schools accountable?
I would think so. That is my personal experience, but I wouldn't put my money on it.
Okay, right, you're hesitant about it, but nevertheless. Any other views on that? How would the short route work? How would you hold schools accountable? Can this happen easily in a situation where parents are illiterate, where parents have little information as to how the school is performing? We did some focus groups in Limpopo at one stage as part of another study. And in those focus groups, we asked parents, so it's a number of parents together, and one has a discussion with them, and we had people speaking the appropriate languages during the discussion, and it was all recorded. And the question asked of parents was, how do you recognize a good primary school? Now, what parents said in that situation was, you can look at two things. The one is, children wear uniforms. So in a good primary school, children wear uniforms. That's a way of saying there's discipline, right? That's their shorthand for discipline. The second thing they said is, you can see it's a good primary school because children are passing. Is that a good measure of a good primary school? Who determines whether children pass? It's the teachers themselves, and they set the standards. So if a teacher wants to avoid having pressure from parents, what do? You simply pass everybody. Right. And that's the difficulty here. So potentially, clients can hold providers accountable. Parents can hold schools accountable, but they need information. They need information to know how the school is performing, because all information they have at the moment is simply, are children passing? So again, and now gives us an opportunity. What typically happens is that parents think they're sending their child to a good school until the child fails matric, and then they realize, when they hopelessly fail, then they realize, but things have gone wrong on the way. Because up to that stage, there's no measurement that the parents can use. All they can use is what they get from the teachers. So if the teachers don't give them the right indicators, they lost. So again, in this accountability framework, we can see the importance in the short route of information. But in the long route also, why would parents complain about schools if they have no idea that schools are performing weakly? Why would they complain to the state? Why would they use the political process? If they don't see that as a problem, they're not going to do anything about it. On the other hand, the state has to have some sort of compact, some contract some way of dealing with providers, teachers. But again, there the state needs to know what information is available, what information tells us whether teachers are doing their job, whether they should be compensated for that, whether they should be sanctioned. We simply don't have that information usually. I'm going to skip this, but this is just to indicate that we've got similar problems in the health sector, generally in the social sectors. So I'm going to skip these for the sake of time and get to the principal agent problem, which is